A Debt Fully Repaid. Washington, D.C., 1923. Amelia Carter discovered a lone set of boot prints outside her front door leading to an empty street, yet the distinct outline of Lieutenant Harold Stevens lingered in her mind. Chapter 1. The lingering scent of gunpowder. The scent still clung to him 5 years after the armistice. Not the acrid, choking stench of the trenches, but a fainter, almost nostalgic ghost of gunpowder and damp earth. Amelia Carter inhaled deeply, leaning against the doorframe of her modest Georgetown row house, the crisp October air doing little to dispel the phantom aroma. It was the scent of Harold, or rather, the scent of the memory of him, a memory that had solidified into something almost tangible in the years since he'd vanished. She traced the outline of the door with a fingertip, the wood worn smooth by countless comings and goings, though few of those had been hers in recent years. She'd spent most of her time at the Walter Reed Hospital, tending to the wounded, the broken men who had returned from a war that had stolen not only their limbs and their minds, but also a piece of her own soul. She'd become intimately familiar with loss, the hollow ache in the chest that never quite healed, the constant, dull throb of absence. The house felt colder than it should, even for a late autumn morning. Amelia wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the knitted wool offering little comfort against the chill that seeped from deep within. She hadn't lit the fire yet. The thought of tending to it, of creating a semblance of warmth and domesticity, felt almost sacrilegious. It was a hollow ritual, a performance of normalcy in a life that had been irrevocably fractured. A robin chirped from the branches of the ancient oak that stood sentinel in her small front yard, its leaves a riot of crimson and gold. The vibrant colors, usually a source of solace, seemed to mock her muted existence. Even nature, it seemed, had moved on, embraced the cycle of renewal, while she remained tethered to the past, to the echoing silence left by Harold's disappearance. It had been a Tuesday, much like this one, when he'd last stood on this very doorstep. She remembered the way the sunlight had caught the silver in his hair, prematurely streaked by the horrors he'd witnessed. He'd been in his dress uniform, the crisp lines of the fabric doing little to disguise the weariness that clung to him like a second skin. He'd been on his way to the War Office, a routine meeting, he'd said, nothing to worry about. But she had worried. She always worried. Every parting felt like a potential farewell, every goodbye laced with the unspoken fear that it might be their last. The war had taught her the fragility of life, the brutal randomness of fate. She'd seen too many young men, their eyes filled with the bright, foolish hope of youth, shipped off to the front, only to return in flag-draped coffins, or worse, not at all. He'd kissed her then, a brief, chaste press of his lips against her forehead, a gesture that had become more habit than passion. The fire that had once burned between them had dwindled to a flickering ember, choked by the unspoken grief and the weight of their shared trauma. She hadn't realized it then, too caught up in her own anxieties, but the distance between them had already begun to widen, a chasm carved by the secrets he kept and the burdens she couldn't share. She'd watched him walk away, his shoulders squared, his stride purposeful, the very picture of the dutiful soldier. He'd turned at the corner, offering a final, fleeting smile, a smile that had haunted her dreams ever since. She'd never seen him again. The official explanation was unsatisfactory. Missing in action, presumed dead. A vague, dismissive phrase that offered no closure, no comfort, only a gaping void where a man, her love, had once been. The War Office had conducted a perfunctory investigation, their inquiries leading to dead ends and unanswered questions. They'd offered their condolences, their platitudes, their carefully worded evasions, and then they'd moved on, their attention focused on the next casualty, the next bureaucratic hurdle. But Amelia hadn't moved on. She couldn't. She refused to believe that he was simply gone. There had to be more to the story. A hidden truth buried beneath the official narrative, a secret that someone, somewhere, was desperately trying to conceal. She'd spent the past 5 years clinging to that belief, to the fragile hope that he was still alive, somewhere, waiting to be found. It was a foolish hope, perhaps, But it was the only thing that kept her going, the only thing that prevented her from succumbing to the overwhelming despair that threatened to consume her. She closed her eyes, conjuring his image in her mind. The crinkle around his eyes when he smiled, the way he used to run his hand through his hair when he was deep in thought, the small, almost imperceptible scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood accident. These details, these fragments of memory, were all she had left of him, and she guarded them fiercely, afraid that they, too, would fade with time, leaving her with nothing but the lingering scent of gunpowder and the hollow echo of a life that might have been. The creak of the gate startled her. She flinched and turned towards the slight noise. It was only Mrs. Henderson, their next-door neighbor, but it sent a small shard of ice down Amelia's spine, even though she recognized the familiar, friendly face. What was she going to do? Chapter 2. Boot Prints in the Morning Dew. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with a perpetually worried expression and a penchant for floral print dresses, was clutching a small, slightly wilting bouquet of chrysanthemums. "Amelia, dear," she said, her voice a mixture of concern and thinly veiled curiosity, "I saw you standing there, lost in thought. Are you all right?" Amelia forced a smile, a practiced gesture that felt increasingly strained. "Just admiring the leaves, Mrs. Henderson. Beautiful, aren't they?" She gestured vaguely towards the oak tree, her gaze avoiding the older woman's probing eyes. Mrs. Henderson followed her gaze, her brow furrowed. "Yes, well, autumn always does put on a show, doesn't it? But you look a bit pale, dear. Are you sure you're feeling well?" "Just a bit tired," Amelia replied, pulling her shawl tighter. "The hospital, it's been busy." It was a half-truth. The hospital was always busy, a constant stream of suffering and sorrow. But her fatigue stemmed from more than just the long hours and the emotionally draining work. It was the weight of her own grief, the constant gnawing uncertainty, that truly exhausted her. Mrs. Henderson, ever perceptive, didn't seem entirely convinced. She stepped closer, her gaze dropping to the doorstep. "My goodness, Amelia," she exclaimed, her voice rising slightly. "Look at that." Amelia followed her gaze, her heart skipping a beat. There, clearly imprinted in the dew-covered flagstones, were a set of boot prints. They were large, distinctly masculine, with the unmistakable tread of military-issue boots. They led from the street, directly to her front door, and then stopped. There were no corresponding prints leading away. It was as if someone had stood there, silently, for an unknown amount of time, and then simply vanished. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen anyone leave. The street was quiet, deserted, save for the occasional passing automobile. Had she been so lost in her thoughts that she'd missed the visitor? Or had something else been at play? Mrs. Henderson, her eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and morbid fascination, leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Do you think it could be him?" Amelia knew exactly who him referred to. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken fears and long-held suspicions. Could Harold have returned, after all these years, only to disappear again, leaving behind nothing but a set of ghostly footprints? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The possibility, however remote, that he might be alive, that he might be close, sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins, a flicker of hope in the darkness. But the circumstances, the inexplicable nature of the footprints, the complete lack of any other trace, filled her with a deep sense of foreboding. She knelt down, tracing the outline of one of the prints with a trembling finger. The dew was already beginning to evaporate, the imprint fading, blurring, just like her memories of him. She had to act quickly, before all evidence, all hope, disappeared completely. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "did you see anyone this morning? Anyone at all?" The older woman shook her head, her eyes darting nervously up and down the street. "No, dear, not a soul. I was up early, tending to my garden, but I didn't see anyone. It's been unusually quiet this morning. Did you hear anything? A car, Footsteps, anything at all? No, nothing. Just the birds and the usual morning sounds. She paused, her gaze fixed on the footprints. It's like he just materialized out of thin air, isn't it? Amelia didn't answer. She stood up, her mind racing. She had to think, to analyze, to find a logical explanation. But logic, she knew, had little place in matters of the heart, or in matters of war. The war had taught her that anything was possible, that the boundaries between reality and illusion, between life and death, were often blurred, sometimes even erased. She looked at Mrs. Henderson, her expression determined. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. You've been very helpful. It was a lie, of course. The older woman's presence had only heightened her anxiety, fueled her fears. But she needed to be alone to think, to plan. Are you sure you're all right, dear? Mrs. Henderson asked, her concern evident. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Amelia insisted, forcing another smile. Just surprised. I'll go inside and think about this. She turned and walked towards the door, her hand reaching for the doorknob. As she stepped inside, she glanced back at the footprints, their outlines already fading, disappearing into the morning mist. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the world, shutting out the questions, shutting out the fear. But she couldn't shut out the image of those boot prints, the undeniable evidence that someone, somehow, had been there. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic and reason, that her life, her carefully constructed world of quiet grief and resigned acceptance, was about to change. The scent of gunpowder was stronger now, almost overwhelming. He was close. She could feel it. But was it him? Or was it something far more sinister? The house creaked, a sound Amelia had not noticed in all the years she resided there. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Psalm. The house settled around her, the unfamiliar creak fading into the usual symphony of settling timbers and ticking clocks. Amelia leaned against the closed door, her heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The boot prints. They couldn't be ignored. They were a tangible link to something. To someone. She pushed herself away from the door and moved through the dim hallway, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper. The house was a repository of memories, each object, each piece of furniture, a silent witness to her life with Harold and to the agonizing emptiness that had followed his disappearance. She paused in the living room, her gaze drawn to the framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a formal portrait, taken shortly before Harold's deployment. He was in his uniform, his expression serious, his eyes holding a hint of the apprehension that he tried so hard to conceal. Amelia, standing beside him, looked younger, more carefree, her smile radiant, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She picked up the photograph, tracing the outline of his face with a fingertip. He looked so alive, so vital, so different from the hollow-eyed ghost that haunted her dreams. She remembered the day the photograph was taken, the stiff formality of the studio, the awkwardness of posing, the underlying tension of knowing that he was leaving, perhaps forever. She'd tried to be brave, to be the supportive, patriotic wife, but inside, she'd been terrified. She'd known, even then, that the war would change him, change them both, in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. And she'd been right. She replaced the photograph and moved to the small, cluttered desk in the corner of the room. It had been Harold's, and she'd kept it exactly as he'd left it, a shrine to his memory, a tangible connection to his absence. The surface was covered with papers, letters, maps, all meticulously organized, a testament to his methodical nature. She sat down at the desk, her fingers hovering over the worn leather surface. She hadn't touched his things in years, afraid that disturbing them would somehow disrupt the fragile equilibrium she'd managed to achieve. But the boot prints had changed everything. They were a sign, a message, a clue. And she had to follow it, no matter where it led. She began to sift through the papers, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Most of it was mundane. Military documents, official correspondence, supply requisitions, the bureaucratic detritus of war. But then, tucked away in a small, unmarked envelope, she found a letter. It was addressed to Harold, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. The postmark was smudged, illegible, but the date was clear. June 14th, 1918. Just a few months before he disappeared. She hesitated, her fingers trembling. This was a violation, an intrusion into his private world. But she couldn't stop now. She had to know. She carefully unfolded the letter, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was cramped, spidery. The ink faded in places. It was written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. My dearest Harold, I know this is a risk, writing to you like this, but I have no choice. The situation is becoming increasingly desperate. They know. They suspect. I fear for my life, and for yours. The information I gave you, it was true. All of it. But it's more dangerous than we ever imagined. They're watching us, Harold. They're watching everyone. You must be careful. Trust no one. Not even your superiors. The rock goes deeper than you think. I have secured a way out. A passage to safety. Meet me at the designated place, on the appointed date. I will explain everything then. Burn this letter after you've read it. For God's sake, Harold, burn it. Yours always, S. Amelia reread the letter several times, her mind reeling. The words were cryptic, veiled, but the underlying message was clear. Harold had been involved in something dangerous, something secret, something that had put both his life and the life of the mysterious S at risk. The Psalm. The letter had mentioned meeting at the designated place. Could that be it? He'd served on the Psalm, had witnessed unimaginable horrors there. She remembered the haunted look in his eyes when he'd spoken of it, the way he'd shuddered at the memories. She reached for a map of France, one of the many that Harold had kept, and spread it out on the desk. Her fingers traced the familiar lines, the names of towns and villages that had become synonymous with death and destruction. Amiens, Albert, Bapaume, Peronne the Somme. She scanned the map, searching for a clue, a hint, anything that might connect to the letter. And then she saw it. A small, almost insignificant marking, a tiny circle drawn in pencil, near the village of Villers-Bretonneux. It was a place he'd mentioned before, a place where he'd experienced something profound, something he'd never fully been able to articulate. Could that be the designated place? The place where he was supposed to meet us? The place where he disappeared? She felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. This was it. This was the lead she'd been waiting for. She had to go there. She had to find out what had happened to him. But how? She was a woman alone, with no resources, no connections, no experience in matters of espionage or intrigue. She was a nurse, not a detective, not a spy. And yet, she knew she had no choice. She had to try. For Harold. For herself. For the truth. A floorboard creaked upstairs. She was not alone. Chapter 4. The Unsent Letter. Amelia froze, her hand still hovering over the map of the Psalm, her ears straining to catch any further sound. The creak had been unmistakable, definitely from upstairs, in the bedroom she and Harold had once shared. She'd been so engrossed in the letter, in her sudden surge of hope and determination, that she'd forgotten to be cautious, forgotten to be afraid. She slowly rose from the desk, her movements deliberate, silent. She had to be sure. It could be the wind, the house settling, her imagination playing tricks on her. But the boot prints, the letter, the growing sense of unease, it all pointed to something more. Someone was in the house. She tiptoed to the hallway, her gaze fixed on the staircase, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears. The house was shrouded in shadows, the dim light filtering through the lace-curtained windows creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. She listened intently, holding her breath. Silence. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a steady, measured beat that seemed to mock her frantic pulse. She took a tentative step towards the staircase, her hand reaching for the banister, the smooth, polished wood cold beneath her fingertips. She had to be brave, had to confront whatever, or whoever, was up there. She couldn't cower in fear, not anymore. She ascended the stairs slowly, carefully, each step creaking softly despite her efforts. The air grew colder, heavier, as she climbed, the scent of dust and old memories mingling with a faint, unfamiliar odor, something metallic, almost like blood. She reached the landing, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her mind racing. Should she call out? Should she run? Should she pretend she hadn't heard anything? But she knew she couldn't. She had to know. She pushed the door open slowly, cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. The bedroom was as she'd left it, the heavy drapes drawn, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. The four-poster bed, with its faded floral quilt, dominated the space, a silent reminder of shared nights, of whispered intimacies, of a love that had been lost, perhaps forever. The room appeared empty. But then she saw it. A slight disturbance in the dust on the bedside table, a faint impression where something had recently rested. And on the floor, beside the bed, a small, crumpled piece of paper. She moved towards it, her legs feeling heavy, leaden. She knelt down, her hand trembling as she reached for the paper. It was a letter, or rather, a fragment of a letter, torn and crumpled, as if it had been discarded in haste. She carefully unfolded it, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was Harold's. The letter was incomplete, undated, unsent. It was addressed to her. My dearest Amelia, I don't know if I'll ever be able to send this, but I have to write it. I have to tell you the truth, or at least as much of the truth as I can. I'm involved in something dangerous. Something I can't fully explain, even to you. I've made promises, sworn oaths, that I can't break. But I'm afraid, Amelia. Terribly afraid. I've seen things, done things, that haunt me day and night. The war, it changed me, more than you know. But this is different. This is a darkness that I can't escape. I love you, Amelia. More than words can say. I always have and I always will. But I fear that my love may not be enough to protect you, to protect us. If anything happens to me, the letter ended there, abruptly, as if he'd been interrupted, or as if he'd simply run out of words, out of courage. Amelia read the letter again and again, her tears blurring the ink, her heart aching with a pain that was almost unbearable. The letter confirmed her worst fears, her deepest suspicions. Harold had been in danger, had been involved in something that had threatened his life, and perhaps still did. But the letter also offered a glimmer of hope. He loved her. He still loved her. And he tried to warn her, to protect her, even from beyond the grave, or wherever he was. She clutched the letter to her chest, her mind racing. She had to find him. She had to find out what had happened to him. And she had to do it now, before it was too late. She stood up, her resolve hardening. She was no longer just a grieving widow, a lonely nurse, a woman haunted by the past. She was a woman on a mission, a woman driven by love, by loyalty, by a desperate need for the truth. The sound of a car pulling up outside, its engine cutting abruptly, jolted her from her renewed determination.
Who was that?
Chapter 5. A dance at the embassy ball. Amelia cautiously approached the window, peering through the gap in the heavy drapes. A black sedan, sleek and imposing, was parked directly in front of her house. The driver, a uniformed man she didn't recognize, remained behind the wheel, his gaze fixed on the front door. A figure emerged from the back seat, tall and slender, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. Even from this distance, silhouetted against the fading afternoon light, Amelia recognized him. It was Arthur Bellingham, a senior official at the War Office, a man she'd met briefly on several occasions during the initial, ultimately fruitless, investigation into Harold's disappearance. He was a man of power and influence, a man known for his sharp intellect and his even sharper tongue. He was also a man who, Amelia suspected, knew far more about Harold's fate than he'd ever let on. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of apprehension and a flicker of anticipation. Bellingham's presence was unexpected, unsettling, but it also represented a potential breakthrough. He was a link to the War Office, to the world of secrets and lies that Harold had been caught up in. She watched as Bellingham approached her front door, his stride purposeful, his expression unreadable. He rang the doorbell, the sound echoing through the silent house, a jarring intrusion into her carefully constructed world of solitude. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the crumpled letter from Harold, still clutched tightly in her grasp. Should she answer the door? Should she confront him? Or should she hide, pretend she wasn't home, and try to slip away unnoticed? But she knew she couldn't hide. Not anymore. She had to face him, had to find out what he wanted, what he knew. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her dress, and tucked the letter into her pocket. She walked to the door, her movements deliberate, her expression carefully composed. She opened the door, meeting Bellingham's gaze directly. "Mr. Bellingham," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "this is unexpected." Bellingham offered a thin, polite smile, a gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Carter," he replied, his voice smooth, polished, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have some matters to discuss with you. Matters of some urgency." "Concerning my husband?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Bellingham's smile faltered, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Yes," he replied, "concerning your husband. May I come in?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house felt different with him in it, smaller, colder, the air thick with unspoken tension. He followed her into the living room, his gaze taking in the familiar surroundings, the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, the cluttered desk in the corner. He paused in front of the photograph, his expression softening slightly. "He was a good man, Harold," he said, his voice almost regretful. "A brave soldier. A loyal patriot." "Was he?" Amelia asked, her voice sharp, her grief and anger bubbling to the surface. "Or was he just a pawn in your games?" Bellingham turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice low, controlled, "I understand your frustration, your grief. But I assure you, I had nothing to do with your husband's disappearance." "Then why are you here?" Amelia demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" Bellingham sighed, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "I'm here because circumstances have changed. New information has come to light. Information that may shed some light on your husband's fate." Amelia felt a surge of hope, a desperate yearning for answers. "What information?" she asked, her voice barely audible.
"Tell me, please."
Bellingham hesitated, his gaze shifting around the room, as if searching for something or someone. "Not here," he said, his voice low. "It's too sensitive, too dangerous." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, embossed card. "There's a ball tonight," he said, "at the French embassy. A gathering of diplomats, military officials, and other interested parties." He handed her the card. Amelia took it, her fingers trembling. The card was an invitation, a formal invitation to a lavish social event, a world she'd long since abandoned. "I want you to be there," Bellingham said, his voice firm. "Wear something appropriate. Something that will allow you to blend in."
"Why?"
Amelia asked, her mind racing. "What's going to happen there?" Bellingham smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Let's just say there may be an opportunity to dance with some old ghosts." The card felt strangely heavy in her hand, the gold embossed lettering reflecting the lamplight. Chapter 6. Shadows in Georgetown. The invitation felt like a lead weight in Amelia's pocket, a tangible symbol of the dangerous game she was now, willingly or not, a part of. Bellingham had left as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving her with more questions and answers, and a growing sense of unease. The French embassy ball. A gathering of the powerful, the secretive, the potentially dangerous. And she, a grieving widow, a simple nurse, was expected to blend in. She looked at the invitation again, the ornate script mocking her simple, practical existence. She hadn't worn an evening gown in years, hadn't attended a social event since before Harold's disappearance. The thought of navigating the glittering world of diplomats and spies, of pretending to be someone she wasn't, filled her with a mixture of dread and a strange, almost exhilarating sense of anticipation. She had to prepare. She had to find a dress, shoes, accessories, a mask. Not a literal mask, but a figurative one, a facade of composure and confidence that would conceal her fear, her vulnerability, her burning desire for the truth. She went upstairs to the bedroom, the room that still held the faint scent of Harold, the room where she'd found his unsent letter. She opened the wardrobe, its doors creaking in protest, revealing a row of dresses, most of them outdated, unfashionable, relics of a life she'd left behind. She sifted through them, her fingers brushing against the fabrics, each touch evoking a memory, a pang of nostalgia, a reminder of happier times. She found a dress she'd almost forgotten, a deep emerald green silk gown, with delicate lace detailing and a subtle, flowing skirt. It was a dress Harold had loved, a dress he'd said made her look like a queen. She held the dress up against herself, looking in the mirror. The reflection that stared back at her was a stranger, a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes were shadowed, her cheeks pale, her expression haunted. But beneath the surface, she saw a flicker of something else, a spark of determination, a hint of the woman she used to be, the woman she needed to be again. She laid the dress on the bed and began to gather the other necessities. Shoes, a small beaded clutch, a pair of long gloves, a simple pearl necklace, the only piece of jewelry she still owned that held any sentimental value. It had been a gift from Harold, a token of his love, a promise of a future that had never materialized. As she prepared, her mind raced, trying to anticipate what awaited her at the ball. What was Bellingham's game? What information did he have about Harold? And who were these old ghosts she was supposed to dance with? She thought about the letter from S, the cryptic message, the warning to trust no one. Could S be at the ball? Could they be one of the interested parties Bellingham had mentioned? She thought about Harold's unsent letter, his confession of fear, his desperate plea for her to be safe. She had to be careful. She had to be smart. She had to play the game, but on her own terms. As dusk settled over Georgetown, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Amelia finished her preparations. She looked in the mirror one last time, her reflection transformed. The emerald green gown shimmered in the dim light, the pearl necklace glowed against her skin, her hair, carefully styled, framed her face, softening the sharp angles of grief and determination. She looked different, stronger, more confident, more dangerous. She took a deep breath, picked up her clutch, and walked out of the house into the night. The air was cool, crisp, the scent of autumn leaves mingling with a faint, lingering aroma of gunpowder, a constant reminder of the man she was searching for, the secrets she was determined to uncover. As she walked towards the waiting taxi, a figure emerged from the shadows across the street, a dark silhouette against the dimly lit houses. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze, intense, unwavering, watching her. She hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. Was it Bellingham's man? Or someone else? Someone connected to Harold? Someone dangerous? She didn't wait to find out. She quickly got into the taxi, giving the driver the address of the French embassy. As the taxi pulled away, she glanced back at the shadowy figure, still standing there, motionless, watching her. The feeling of being watched didn't leave her, even when the cab started to pick up its speed. Chapter 7. The Ciphered Telegram. The French embassy was ablaze with light, a glittering beacon of opulence and privilege in the otherwise subdued landscape of Washington, D.C. Music spilled out onto the street, a lively waltz that seemed incongruous with the somber thoughts swirling in Amelia's mind. Carriages and automobiles lined the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the glow of the gas lamps, their occupants, a parade of elegantly dressed men and women, disappearing into the embassy's grand entrance. Amelia felt a wave of apprehension as she stepped out of the taxi, the emerald green silk of her gown rustling softly against the pavement. She felt out of place, an imposter in this world of wealth and power, a woman with a hidden agenda, a woman searching for a ghost in a sea of strangers. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of Bellingham's instructions. Blend in. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked towards the entrance, her heart pounding a steady rhythm against her ribs. The embassy's interior was even more dazzling than its exterior. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high, vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden light on the polished marble floors, the richly embroidered tapestries, the gilded furniture. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, cigars, and expensive champagne, a heady mixture that made Amelia's head spin. The ballroom was a sea of swirling figures, men in formal attire, women in shimmering gowns, their laughter and conversation a constant, buzzing undercurrent to the music. Amelia felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to turn and flee, to escape back to the quiet solitude of her Georgetown home. But she couldn't. She had to find Bellingham. She had to find answers. She scanned the crowd, her gaze darting from face to face, searching for a familiar figure, a sign, a clue. She saw diplomats, military officers, politicians, socialites, a kaleidoscope of faces, all of them strangers, all of them potential suspects. She felt a hand on her arm, a light, gentle touch that made her jump. She turned to see a man standing beside her, tall, dark-haired, with piercing blue eyes and a charming, almost disarming smile. "Mrs. Carter, I presume?" he said, his voice low, smooth, with a hint of a French accent. "I am Jean-Luc Dubois, a colleague of Mr. Bellingham's." Amelia nodded, her heart still racing. "Mr. Dubois," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's a pleasure." "The pleasure is all mine," Dubois replied, his smile widening. "Mr. Bellingham asked me to keep an eye out for you. He's been detained."
Detained?
Amelia asked, her apprehension growing. "By whom?" Dubois shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Matters of state, I presume. These things happen. But he sends his apologies, and he assures you that he will join us as soon as he can." He offered her his arm. "May I have the honor of this dance, Mrs. Carter?" Amelia hesitated. She didn't trust Dubois, didn't trust anyone in this gilded cage. But she also knew that she had to play the game, had to follow Bellingham's instructions, had to blend in. She took his arm, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. The waltz swirled around them, the music a dizzying vortex, the faces a blur of color and motion. "You seem a bit out of your element, Mrs. Carter," Dubois said, his voice close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "I haven't been to a gathering like this in quite some time," Amelia replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Ah, yes," Dubois said, his gaze sweeping over her. "The war. It changed us all, didn't it? Especially those who lost someone." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. He knew. He knew about Harold. But how? "Mr. Bellingham tells me you're interested in your husband's disappearance," Dubois continued, his voice low, conspiratorial. "I am," Amelia replied, her voice firm. "I want to know the truth." "The truth," Dubois said, his smile fading, "is a dangerous thing, Mrs. Carter. Especially in times of war. Especially in times of peace." He pulled her closer, his hand tightening on hers. "Mr. Bellingham has discovered something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something that may shed some light on your husband's fate." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, folded piece of paper. "This arrived for him earlier this evening," he said, "a telegram. From a source in France." He handed her the telegram. Amelia took it, her fingers trembling. The telegram was sealed, addressed to Bellingham, in a familiar, spidery handwriting. The same handwriting as the letter from S. "It's ciphered," Dubois said, his voice low. "Mr. Bellingham asked me to deliver it to you. He believes you may be able to decipher it." Amelia stared at the telegram, her mind racing. A ciphered message. From S. About Harold. She had to decode it. She had to find out what it said.
But how?
And where? She couldn't do it here, in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by strangers, by potential enemies. I need to," Amelia stammered, her voice trailing off. "I understand," Dubois said, his smile returning. "You need a quiet place. A place to think." He led her off the dance floor, towards a small, dimly lit alcove, hidden behind a large potted palm. "Here," he said, "this should be private enough." He gestured for her to open the telegram. She hesitated. She felt like a mouse, walking straight into a carefully crafted trap. Chapter 8. Promises Under a Wounded Moon. The alcove was a small, secluded space, offering a modicum of privacy from the swirling revelry of the ballroom. The air was still thick with the scent of perfume and champagne, but the noise of the music and conversation was muted, allowing Amelia a moment to gather her thoughts, to steel her nerves. She looked at Dubois, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. She still didn't trust him, but she had no choice.
She had to see what the telegram said.
She carefully broke the seal, unfolding the delicate paper, her fingers trembling. The message was, as Dubois had said, ciphered. A jumble of letters and numbers, seemingly meaningless, a chaotic scramble that held the key to Harold's fate. She recognized the cipher, or at least, she thought she did. It was a simple substitution cipher, one that Harold had taught her, years ago, during their courtship, a playful game they'd used to exchange secret messages, love notes hidden in plain sight. It was a cipher based on a shared keyword, a word that held special significance for them, a word that only they knew. She closed her eyes, searching her memory, reaching back to those happier times, to the whispered promises, the shared dreams, the secret language of love. And then it came to her. Verity. It was a word they'd used often, a word that represented their commitment to honesty, to truth, to each other. It was a word that had become their private code, their unbreakable bond. She quickly scanned the telegram, substituting the letters according to the cipher, using Verity as the key. The meaningless jumble began to coalesce, to form words, sentences, a message, a desperate plea from the mysterious S. Harold alive.
Danger imminent.
Villers-Bretonneux. Church ruins. Midnight. Tomorrow. Trust no one. S. Amelia reread the message, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. Harold was alive. He was in danger. He was in Villers-Bretonneux, the place she'd seen marked on the map, the place where he'd disappeared. She had to go there. She had to go to him. She had to save him. But the message also contained a warning. Trust no one. Not even Dubois? Not even Bellingham? She looked up at Dubois, his eyes fixed on her, waiting, watching. What does it say? He asked, his voice low, his expression curious? Anxious? She hesitated. Could she trust him? Could she risk revealing the truth? Or should she play along, pretend she couldn't decipher the message, keep the information to herself? She decided to take a risk, a calculated risk. She would reveal part of the truth, but not all of it. It's about my husband, she said, her voice trembling. He's alive. Dubois's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps relief. Alive? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Are you sure? Yes, Amelia replied. The telegram says he's in France. In a small village. She didn't mention Villers-Bretonneux, didn't mention the church ruins, didn't mention the midnight rendezvous. That's incredible, Dubois said, his voice regaining its composure. Mr. Bellingham will be pleased. He's been working tirelessly to find her husband. Was he sincere? Or was he lying? Amelia couldn't tell. She had to be careful, had to play her cards close to her chest. I need to go to him, Amelia said, her voice firm, determined. I need to go to France.
Tonight.
Dubois nodded, his expression thoughtful. Of course, he said, I understand. I'll make the arrangements. A car, a plane, whatever is necessary. Thank you, Amelia said, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. He smiled, a charming, disarming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's the least I can do, he said, for a friend of Mr. Bellingham's. He offered her his arm again. Shall we return to the ball? He asked. Mr. Bellingham should be here soon. And I'm sure he'll want to discuss this development with you. Amelia took his arm, her mind racing. She had a plan. She had a destination. She had a glimmer of hope. But she also had a growing sense of danger, a feeling that she was walking into a trap, a web of deceit and betrayal. As they walked back into the ballroom, the music seemed louder, the lights brighter, the faces more menacing. She scanned the crowd, searching for Bellingham, searching for someone she could trust. But she saw no one. Only strangers, potential enemies, their smiles masking hidden agendas, their eyes filled with secrets. The moon, visible through a tall window, was partially obscured by clouds, casting a pale, wounded light over the scene. It seemed fitting. Chapter 9. The weight of a silver locket. The ballroom felt increasingly suffocating, the music a jarring cacophony, the laughter and conversation a cruel mockery of her anxiety. Amelia felt Dubois's grip tighten on her arm, a subtle reminder that she was not alone, that she was being watched, controlled. She searched the crowd again, her gaze desperate, searching for Bellingham, for a sign, a clue, anything that might offer her guidance, reassurance, a way out of this increasingly treacherous situation. She spotted him across the room, standing near a group of dignitaries, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. He looked agitated, his usually impeccable composure ruffled, his expression worried, angry. She tried to catch his eye, but he didn't see her. His attention focused on the men he was talking to, their faces grim, their gestures animated. "Mr. Bellingham seems preoccupied," Dubois said, his voice close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Perhaps we should wait." "No," Amelia replied, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. "I need to talk to him.
Now."
She pulled her arm away from Dubois, her movements abrupt, unexpected. She walked towards Bellingham, her steps determined, her gaze fixed on his face. As she approached, she saw that the men he was talking to were high-ranking military officers, their uniforms adorned with medals and insignia, their expressions serious, their conversation hushed. They were discussing something important, something secret, something that had clearly upset Bellingham. She reached him, interrupting their conversation, her voice clear, unwavering. "Mr. Bellingham," she said, "I need to speak with you. Alone." Bellingham turned to face her, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in annoyance. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice strained, "this is not a good time." "It's about my husband," Amelia insisted, her voice low, urgent, the telegram. "I've deciphered it." Bellingham's expression changed, his annoyance replaced by a flicker of interest? Alarm? He glanced at the officers, then back at Amelia. "Very well," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Follow me." He led her away from the group, towards a small, deserted anteroom, its walls lined with bookshelves, its air thick with the scent of old leather and dust. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the noise of the ballroom, creating a sense of intimacy, of danger. "What does it say?" Bellingham asked, his voice urgent, his gaze fixed on her face. Amelia hesitated. Could she trust him? Could she reveal the full contents of the telegram, the rendezvous at Villers-Bretonneux, the midnight meeting? She decided to take a gamble, to trust her instincts, to believe that Bellingham, despite his ambiguous role in this affair, was ultimately on her side, or at least, that their interests aligned. "Harold is alive," she said, her voice trembling. "He's in France, in a village called Villers-Bretonneux. He's meeting someone at the church ruins. Tonight. At midnight." Bellingham stared at her, his expression unreadable, his silence deafening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver locket, a small, intricately engraved piece of jewelry. He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of a woman, a beautiful woman with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. "Do you recognize her?" Bellingham asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the portrait. Amelia looked at the locket, her heart skipping a beat. She recognized the woman. It was the same woman who had been in the photograph with Harold. The small, bullet-ridden picture that she always saw in his nightmares. The woman he could never speak of. "Yes," Amelia replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I've seen her before. In a photograph. With Harold." Bellingham nodded, his expression grim. "Her name is Sophie Devereux," he said. "She was a French intelligence agent. She was working with Harold. During the war. She's S. Amelia asked, her mind racing, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Yes, Bellingham replied. She's S. And she's in danger. We believe she's been compromised. That her cover has been blown. He was clenching the locket so tightly that Amelia could see his knuckles turn white. Chapter 10. Betrayal at the War Office. Bellingham closed the locket with a snap, the sound sharp and decisive in the quiet room. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, the unspoken implications of Sophie's compromised identity sending a shiver down Amelia's spine. We have to warn them, Amelia said, her voice urgent, her mind racing. We have to get to Villers-Bretonneux before it's too late. Bellingham nodded, his expression grim. I agree, he said, but it's not that simple. We're dealing with a complex situation. A situation that involves betrayal. At the highest levels. Betrayal? Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? Bellingham hesitated, his gaze shifting around the room, as if checking for eavesdroppers, even in this secluded space. There's a leak, he said, his voice low, controlled. Someone within the War Office, someone with access to classified information has been collaborating with the enemy. The enemy? Amelia repeated, her mind reeling. But the war is over. The war may be over, Bellingham replied, his voice sardonic. But the battles continue. The fight for power, for influence, for control, it never ends. He paused, his gaze fixed on Amelia's face, his expression searching, evaluating. We believe this traitor is responsible for Harold's disappearance, he said, his voice low, his words heavy with implication. And for Sophie's current predicament. Amelia felt a surge of anger, a burning rage directed at this unknown traitor, this person who had betrayed Harold, betrayed Sophie, betrayed their country. Who is it? Amelia demanded, her voice trembling. Who is the traitor? Bellingham shook his head, his expression regretful. We don't know, he said. We have our suspicions but no proof. That's why we need to get to Villers-Bretonneux. To find Harold and Sophie. To get them to safety. And to uncover the truth. He looked at Amelia, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and apprehension. I'm going to France, he said, his voice firm. I'm leaving tonight. I have a plane waiting. I'm going with you, Amelia said, her voice unwavering, her resolve hardening. Bellingham hesitated, his gaze searching her face. It's dangerous, Mrs. Carter, he said, very dangerous. You could be killed. I don't care, Amelia replied, her voice defiant. Harold is my husband. I have to find him. I have to help him. Bellingham nodded, his expression admiring, respectful. Very well, he said, but you must do exactly as I say. No questions.
No hesitation. No mistakes.
I understand, Amelia replied, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on his. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, silver pistol, a weapon that looked both elegant and deadly. He handed it to her. Do you know how to use one of these? He asked, his voice low. Amelia hesitated. She'd never held a gun before, never even touched one. The thought of using it, of potentially taking a life, filled her with a mixture of fear and a strange, almost primal sense of empowerment. No, she replied, her voice barely a whisper, but I can learn. Bellingham nodded, his expression grim. You may have to, he said. We're walking into a war zone, Mrs. Carter. A war zone of secrets and lies. And we may have to fight to survive. He turned and walked towards the door, his movements purposeful, his expression determined. Let's go, he said, his voice low, urgent. We don't have much time. Before they left the room, he turned to her and asked her, Are you sure you are ready for this? Chapter 11. Echoes of a distant battlefield. Amelia looked at Bellingham, the weight of the silver pistol heavy in her pocket, the weight of his question even heavier in her heart. Was she ready?
No.
She was terrified. But fear, she knew, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Yes, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt, her gaze meeting his unflinchingly. I'm ready. It wasn't entirely a lie. While fear still gnawed at her, a deeper, more powerful emotion had taken root, determination. Determination fueled by love, by loyalty, by a burning need for justice. Bellingham nodded, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. He opened the door, and they stepped back into the chaotic swirl of the embassy ball, a world that now seemed utterly alien, a frivolous distraction from the deadly game they were about to play. They moved quickly through the crowd, Bellingham leading the way, his presence parting the sea of revelers like a ship cutting through waves. Amelia followed close behind, her senses on high alert, her gaze scanning the faces around them, searching for any sign of threat, any hint of recognition. They reached the entrance, and Bellingham signaled to a waiting car, the same black sedan that had brought him earlier. The driver jumped out, opening the back door for them, his movements crisp, efficient. As they sped away from the embassy, the glittering lights fading into the distance, Amelia felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a film, a scene from someone else's life. The reality of what she was doing, the danger she was facing, hadn't fully sunk in. The drive to the airfield was silent, tense. Bellingham sat beside her, his face grim, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Amelia clutched the pistol in her pocket, the cold metal a constant reminder of the stakes involved. They arrived at a small, private airfield, shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from a few scattered lights and the pale glow of the moon. A single-engine plane sat on the tarmac, its propeller already spinning, its engine a low, throbbing growl. A man in a flight suit approached them, his face obscured by goggles and a leather helmet. "Ready, sir?" he asked Bellingham, his voice muffled. Bellingham nodded. "Let's go," he said, his voice terse. He helped Amelia into the plane, the small cabin cramped and claustrophobic. The scent of aviation fuel and leather filled the air, a pungent mixture that made her stomach churn. As the plane taxied down the runway, gathering speed, Amelia looked out the window, watching the lights of Washington, D.C. disappear below, replaced by the dark expanse of the countryside. She felt a pang of fear, a sense of isolation, a realization that she was leaving everything behind, venturing into the unknown, into a world of danger and uncertainty. The plane lifted off the ground, the engine roaring, the vibrations shaking her body. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She thought of Harold, of his face, his smile, his touch. She thought of the letter, of his desperate plea for her to be safe. She thought of Sophie, of the danger she was in, of the betrayal that had put them both at risk. She opened her eyes, her fear replaced by a steely resolve. She would find Harold. She would save Sophie. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The flight was long and turbulent, the small plane buffeted by strong winds, the engine a constant, deafening drone. Amelia sat in silence, her mind racing, her thoughts a jumble of fear, hope, and determination. As they approached France, the landscape below began to change, the rolling hills and fields giving way to a scarred and broken terrain, a landscape still bearing the wounds of war. Amelia saw the trenches, the shell craters, the ruined villages, the ghostly remnants of a battlefield that had once been a scene of unimaginable horror. She saw the echoes of the Somme, the place where Harold had disappeared, the place where she hoped to find him again. She felt a lump in her throat, a wave of grief and anger washing over her. The war may have been over, but its legacy lived on, in the scarred landscape, in the broken lives, in the secrets that still haunted the shadows. The plane began to descend, the engine slowing, the vibrations decreasing. They were approaching their destination, a small, remote airfield near Villers-Bretonneux, a place that held the key to Harold's fate, a place that might also hold her own. The plane touched down, bumping along the rough runway, coming to a jarring halt. Amelia felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was here, in France, in the heart of the battlefield, in the heart of the mystery. As she stepped out of the plane, into the cold night air, the scent of damp earth and distant smoke filled her nostrils, a familiar, haunting aroma that transported her back to the hospital, to the wounded soldiers, to the constant presence of death and loss. She was on a new battlefield now. The same wounded moon that had shone down on the embassy was present here, but instead, it illuminated an empty, dark airstrip. Chapter 12. The Missing Photograph. The airfield was deserted. The only sign of life the small, single-engine plane that had brought them, and the flickering light of a single lantern hanging near a dilapidated shed. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of the nearby battlefield, a smell that brought back a flood of memories, both painful and poignant. Bellingham, his face grim and determined, surveyed the scene, his hand resting on the pistol tucked into his belt. "Stay close," he said to Amelia, his voice low, almost a whisper. "And be quiet." Amelia nodded, her own hand instinctively moving to the pocket where she'd concealed the silver pistol he'd given her. She felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a fierce determination, a sense of purpose that had been growing stronger with each passing hour. They moved towards the shed, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. As they approached, Amelia noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the shed, a tall, slender silhouette that seemed to materialize out of the darkness. She felt a surge of apprehension, her hand tightening on the pistol. "Bellingham?" A voice called out, a woman's voice, low and husky, with a distinct French accent. Bellingham relaxed slightly, his hand moving away from his pistol. "Sophie?" he replied, his voice questioning. The figure stepped forward into the light, revealing a woman in her late 30s, her face pale and drawn, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and fear. It was Sophie Devereux, the woman from the locket, the woman from Harold's photograph, the mysterious S. "Thank God you're here," Sophie said, her voice relieved, but her eyes still darting nervously around, as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. "We got your message," Bellingham said. "We came as quickly as we could." Sophie nodded, her gaze shifting to Amelia, her expression questioning. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice suspicious. "This is Amelia Carter," Bellingham replied, Harold's wife. Sophie's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even sympathy. "His wife," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know she knows about you," Bellingham said, his voice reassuring. "She's here to help." Sophie looked at Amelia, her gaze intense, searching, as if trying to assess her trustworthiness, her strength, her resolve. "He's alive," Amelia said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Sophie's unflinchingly. "I know he's alive. And I'm going to find him." Sophie nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "He is alive," she confirmed, "but he's in danger. We both are." "We know about the leak," Bellingham said, "the betrayal at the War Office." Sophie's expression hardened, her eyes filled with anger. "They're hunting us," she said, her voice low, venomous. "They want us silenced."
Permanently.
"Who are they?" Amelia asked, her voice urgent, her mind racing. Sophie hesitated, her gaze shifting between Amelia and Bellingham. "It's complicated," she said, "a network of powerful individuals. People with connections. People who want to rewrite history. They're after something," Bellingham said, his voice grim. "Something Harold and Sophie discovered. Something that could expose them." "What is it?" Amelia asked, her voice insistent. "What did they find?" Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a photograph, or rather, a fragment of a photograph, torn and faded, as if it had been deliberately damaged. "This," she said, her voice trembling, "this is what they're after. This is what they want to destroy." She handed the photograph to Amelia. Amelia took it, her fingers trembling, her heart pounding. The photograph was badly damaged, most of it missing, but she could still make out a portion of the image, a group of men in uniform, standing in front of a building? A monument? And then she saw him. In the corner of the photograph, partially obscured, but still recognizable, was Harold. He was younger, his face less haunted, his expression different. He was standing next to a man she didn't recognize, a man with a stern face and piercing eyes, a man who seemed to exude power and menace. The missing portion of the photograph, Amelia realized, must have contained something crucial, something that linked Harold and this unknown man to something. Something dangerous. Something that someone wanted to keep hidden. She looked closer at the existing part of the photo, and on the corner she recognized the faint outline of the Eiffel Tower. Chapter 13. A Meeting by the Potomac. The realization that the photograph had been taken in Paris, with the Eiffel Tower subtly visible, added another layer to the mystery. It wasn't just about the Somme, about the trenches and the horrors of the battlefield. It was about something bigger, something that stretched beyond the war, something that had roots in the heart of French power. "We need to find the rest of this photograph," Amelia said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Sophie's and Bellingham's. "It's the key. It's the proof." Sophie nodded, her expression grim. "I know," she said, "but it's not going to be easy. They've covered their tracks well. They've destroyed evidence, silenced witnesses, manipulated events. Where do we start?" Bellingham asked, his voice pragmatic, his focus shifting to the immediate task at hand. Sophie hesitated, her gaze darting around, as if still unsure of their surroundings, still wary of potential threats. "There's someone," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "someone in Paris who might be able to help. Someone who knew Harold. Someone who knows about the photograph." "Who?" Amelia asked, her voice urgent, her mind racing. "His name is Marcel Dubois," Sophie replied. "He's a former colleague. A friend. He works at the Ministry of War."
Dubois.
The name struck a chord, a dissonant note in Amelia's mind. Jean-Luc Dubois, the man at the embassy ball, the man who had delivered the ciphered telegram, the man who had claimed to be Bellingham's colleague. "Dubois?" Amelia asked, her voice sharp, her suspicion rising. "Are you sure we can trust him?" Sophie looked at Amelia, her expression conflicted. "Uncertain?" I don't know," she admitted, her voice troubled. "I haven't seen him in years. But he was loyal. To Harold.
To me.
He was at the embassy ball," Amelia said, her voice accusing. "He gave me the telegram. He said he was working with Bellingham." Bellingham frowned, his expression confused. "Dubois?" he repeated. "I don't know any Dubois. I've never worked with anyone by that name." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. Dubois had lied. He wasn't Bellingham's colleague. He was something else. Someone else. "He's playing us," Amelia said, her voice firm, her conviction growing. "He's part of it. He's one of them." Sophie looked at Amelia, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. "You're right," she said, her voice low, her anger rising. "He must be. He's the leak. He's the traitor." "We need to get out of here," Bellingham said, his voice urgent, his hand moving to his pistol. "We need to get to Paris. To find Marcel Dubois.
And to get the truth."
They quickly boarded the plane again, the sense of urgency palpable, the danger looming larger than ever. As the plane took off, heading towards Paris, Amelia felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and determination. She knew they were walking into a trap, a web of deceit and betrayal, but she also knew that they had no choice. They had to confront Dubois, had to uncover his role in this conspiracy, had to find the missing photograph, had to save Harold. The flight to Paris was short, tense. Amelia sat in silence, her mind racing, her thoughts focused on Dubois, on the photograph, on Harold. She clutched the fragment of the photograph in her hand, the image of Harold's face a constant reminder of what was at stake. As they approached Paris, the city lights spread out below them, a glittering tapestry of beauty and intrigue. Amelia felt a pang of something. It was a city she'd always dreamed of visiting, a city of romance, of art, of history. But now, it was a city of danger, of secrets, of betrayal. Bellingham arranged for a car and instructed that they be taken to a safe house outside the core city, a discreet location. But Amelia insisted they first swing by the Potomac. She had to see if what was rising within her was true. Chapter 14. The Cost of Silence. Bellingham looked at Amelia, his eyebrows raised in a mixture of surprise and skepticism. The Potomac? He repeated, his voice questioning. Now?
Why?
I need to see something, Amelia replied, her voice hesitant, her explanation vague.
Someone.
It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a hunch, a feeling, a connection she couldn't fully explain. But she had to try. She had to follow her intuition, her gut instinct, the voice that had been guiding her, however faintly, throughout this perilous journey. Bellingham hesitated, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to decipher her motives, her reasoning. He clearly thought it was a waste of time, a dangerous detour, but he also saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had brought her this far. All right, he conceded, his voice grudging, but we make it quick. We don't have time to waste. He instructed the driver to take them to the Potomac River, to a specific spot near the Georgetown waterfront, a place that held a special significance for Amelia, a place that echoed with memories of Harold. As they drove through the darkened streets of Washington, D.C., Amelia felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of something significant, something that could change everything. They arrived at the river, the water dark and still, reflecting the faint glow of the moon and the distant city lights. The air was cold, damp, the scent of the river mingling with the faint aroma of exhaust fumes. Amelia stepped out of the car, her gaze fixed on the water, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked towards the edge of the river, her footsteps echoing on the wooden planks of the pier. And then she saw him. Standing at the end of the pier, silhouetted against the water, was a figure, tall and slender, his posture familiar, his presence unmistakable. It was Harold. Amelia felt a surge of emotion, a wave of disbelief, of joy, of overwhelming relief. She wanted to run to him, to embrace him, to tell him everything, to ask him 1,000 questions. But something stopped her. Something wasn't right. His posture was stiff, unnatural. His silence was unnerving. And he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, partially hidden in the shadows, was another figure, a man she recognized, a man she'd trusted, a man she now knew was her enemy. It was Jean-Luc Dubois. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine, a cold realization dawning on her. This wasn't a reunion. It was a trap. Harold? She called out, her voice trembling, her hope flickering, fading. Harold didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, silent, motionless, like a statue, a ghost. Dubois stepped forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Welcome, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice smooth, his French accent more pronounced, more menacing. "We've been expecting you." "Where is he?" Amelia demanded, her voice rising, her fear mixed with anger. "What have you done to him?" Dubois chuckled, a cold, heartless sound that echoed across the water. "He's here," he replied, gesturing towards Harold. "But he's not himself. Not anymore." Amelia looked at Harold again, her eyes filled with tears, her heart breaking. She saw the blank stare, the vacant eyes, the emptiness. He was alive, but he wasn't there. He was a shell, a puppet controlled by someone else, by Dubois. "You drugged him," Amelia said, her voice low, her anger simmering. "You've poisoned him." Dubois nodded, his smile widening. "A special concoction," he said, his voice smug, "a mixture of herbs and chemicals. It renders him compliant, obedient. He'll do whatever we tell him to do."
Why?
Amelia asked, her voice desperate, her mind reeling. "Why are you doing this?" Dubois shrugged, his expression indifferent. "He knows too much," he replied. "He saw too much. He had to be silenced." "The photograph," Amelia said, her voice firm, her gaze fixed on Dubois. "It's about the photograph, isn't it?" Dubois's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even fear, crossing his face. "You know about the photograph?" he asked, his voice losing its composure. "Yes," Amelia replied, "and I know who you are. You're not just a colleague of Bellingham's. You're one of them. The traitors. The ones who are trying to rewrite history." Bellingham emerged from the car, his silhouette barely visible in the dark. His gun was drawn. Chapter 15. Scars Beneath the Uniform. Bellingham's sudden appearance, his gun drawn and aimed at Du Bois, shifted the balance of power, the tense standoff on the Potomac pier escalating into a full-blown confrontation. Du Bois, Bellingham said, his voice cold, hard, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Let him go.
Now.
Du Bois chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed across the still water. I don't think so, Bellingham, he replied, his voice regaining its composure, its smugness. You're outnumbered. And outgunned. As if on cue, two figures emerged from the shadows behind Du Bois, their faces obscured by the darkness, but their intentions clear. They were armed, their weapons glinting ominously in the faint moonlight. Amelia felt a surge of fear, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them take Harold, not again. She reached into her pocket, her hand closing around the cold metal of the silver pistol Bellingham had given her. She pulled it out, her movements surprisingly steady, her aim fixed on Du Bois. Let him go, Amelia repeated, her voice firm, unwavering, her finger tightening on the trigger. Or I swear I'll shoot. Du Bois looked at Amelia, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, crossing his face. He hadn't expected her to be armed, to be so resolute. You wouldn't, Du Bois scoffed, his voice still confident, but his eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. You're a nurse, not a killer. Try me, Amelia replied, her voice cold, her gaze unflinching. The standoff continued, the tension thick, palpable, the silence broken only by the lapping of the water against the pier and the distant sounds of the city. Suddenly, a movement. Harold. He stirred, his head turning slightly, his blank eyes flickering with a hint of recognition. He looked at Amelia, his gaze focusing on her face, his lips moving, forming a single, silent word. Run. Amelia felt a surge of hope, a flicker of belief that Harold was still in there, somewhere, fighting to break free from the drug-induced haze, fighting to regain control. But it was too late. Du Bois saw the flicker of recognition in Harold's eyes, the subtle shift in his posture. He reacted instantly, his movements swift, brutal. He grabbed Harold, pulling him closer, using him as a shield, his arm tightening around Harold's neck, his other hand holding a knife to Harold's throat. Don't move. Du Bois shouted, his voice desperate, his control slipping, or I'll kill him. I swear, I'll kill him. Amelia froze, her finger loosening on the trigger, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't shoot, not with Harold in the way. Bellingham lowered his gun slightly, his face grim, his expression a mixture of frustration and despair. He was trapped, just like Amelia. What do you want, Du Bois? Bellingham asked, his voice low, controlled, trying to regain the upper hand, trying to negotiate. The photograph, Du Bois replied, his voice tight, his grip on Harold tightening. Give me the photograph, and I'll let him live. Amelia hesitated. The photograph. It was the key, the evidence, the only way to expose Du Bois and his network of traitors. But it was also Harold's life. She looked at Harold, his eyes pleading, his face pale, his breathing shallow. She couldn't sacrifice him. Not for anything. All right, Amelia said, her voice trembling, her heart breaking. I'll give it to you. Just let him go. She reached into her pocket, her hand closing around the fragment of the photograph, the image of Harold's face, the clue to the mystery, the symbol of their love, their loss, their hope. She pulled it out, holding it up, offering it to Du Bois. Step away from him, Amelia said, her voice firm, her gaze fixed on Du Bois, and I'll give you the photograph. Du Bois hesitated, his eyes darting between Amelia, Bellingham, and the photograph. He was weighing his options, calculating his risks. He nodded, his grip on Harold loosening slightly. All right, he said, his voice grudging, step away. Slowly. Amelia took a step back, her eyes still fixed on Du Bois, her hand still holding the photograph. As she moved, Harold suddenly twisted in Du Bois' grasp, striking at him with sudden force. Chapter 16. The Spy's Confession. Harold's sudden burst of resistance, a flicker of his former self breaking through the drug-induced haze, caught Du Bois off guard. He stumbled, his grip loosening on Harold, the knife clattering to the wooden planks of the pier. Bellingham reacted instantly, seizing the opportunity. He raised his gun, firing a shot that went wide, deliberately missing Du Bois, but forcing the two henchmen to dive for cover. Amelia didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, tackling Du Bois, knocking him to the ground, the fragment of the photograph flying from her hand, landing near the edge of the pier. The two men struggled, their bodies grappling on the rough wooden planks, the sounds of their fight echoing across the still water. Du Bois, despite his initial surprise, was stronger, more experienced, his movements brutal, desperate. He managed to overpower Amelia, pinning her beneath him, his hands closing around her throat, his face contorted with rage. "You bitch!" he hissed, his voice venomous, his grip tightening. "You'll pay for this." Amelia gasped for air, her vision blurring, her strength fading. She struggled against him, but it was no use. He was too strong. Suddenly, a shot rang out, a single, deafening blast that echoed across the river. Du Bois stiffened, his grip loosening, his eyes widening in surprise, in pain. He slumped forward, collapsing on top of Amelia, his body heavy, lifeless. Amelia pushed him off, scrambling to her feet, her lungs burning, her heart pounding. She looked around, her gaze searching for the source of the shot, her mind reeling. She saw Harold standing a few feet away, his arm outstretched, his hand holding Bellingham's pistol, the weapon still smoking. He'd shot Du Bois. He'd saved her. But his eyes were still blank, his expression vacant, his movements robotic. He was still under the influence of the drug, still not fully himself. Bellingham rushed forward, his gun still drawn, his face grim. He checked Du Bois' pulse, confirming that he was dead. "He's gone," Bellingham said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on Harold. "But he's still not safe." He looked at Amelia, his expression apologetic.
Regretful?
"We need to get him out of here," he said. "We need to get him to a doctor. Someone who can reverse the effects of the drug." Amelia nodded, her mind racing.
She knew he was right.
Harold needed help, immediate help. They retrieved the fragment of the photograph, the crucial piece of evidence that had almost cost them their lives. They left Du Bois' body on the pier, a grim testament to the cost of silence, the price of betrayal. As they drove away from the Potomac, the sirens of approaching police cars wailing in the distance, Amelia looked at Harold, his head lolling against the seat, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. She reached out, taking his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was cold, unresponsive, but she held it tight, her touch a silent promise, a vow to stay by his side, to fight for him, to bring him back. The car pulled up near a discreet medical facility, unmarked. Inside, under dim lighting, a woman waited.
"Sophie,"
he confessed, she said as soon as they entered, her voice tight with anger and a hint of relief. Before he died, Du Bois confessed everything. Chapter 17. Flight from a Broken City. Sophie's words hung in the air, a stark revelation in the dimly lit, sterile environment of the clandestine medical facility. Du Bois' confession, extracted in his dying moments, had apparently unveiled the intricate web of deceit and betrayal that had ensnared them all. "What did he say?" Bellingham asked, his voice urgent, his gaze fixed on Sophie, his concern for Harold evident in the lines etched on his face. Sophie took a deep breath, her own face pale and drawn, the strain of the past few hours etched on her features. "He confirmed that the leak was within the War Office," she said, her voice low, her French accent thickening with emotion. "A group of high-ranking officials, disillusioned with the outcome of the war, seeking to reshape the political landscape. They saw an opportunity to exploit the chaos, to seize power." "And the photograph?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hand still tightly clasping Harold's, her fear for him a constant, throbbing ache. "The photograph," Sophie replied, "shows those officials meeting with representatives of a foreign power shortly before the armistice. It's proof of their treason. their conspiracy to undermine the peace negotiations, to prolong the war for their own gain. Amelia felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at the greed, the ambition, the callous disregard for human life that had fueled this conspiracy. These men, these powerful men, had manipulated events, sacrificed lives, betrayed their countries, all for their own selfish purposes. Du Bois said they were planning to use the information, the photograph, to blackmail the French government. Sophie continued, her voice trembling, to force them to make concessions, to cede territory, to alter the terms of the peace treaty. And Harold, he found out about it? Amelia asked, her voice filled with a mixture of dread and pride. Yes, Sophie replied, he stumbled upon it, quite by accident. He saw something he shouldn't have seen, heard something he shouldn't have heard. He realized the implications, the danger. He tried to expose them. But they were too powerful. They silenced him. They took him. And you? Bellingham asked, his voice low, his gaze shifting to Sophie. How did you get involved? Sophie hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mixture of pain and regret. I was working with Harold, she said, her voice barely audible. We were investigating a series of suspicious deaths. Soldiers who had witnessed something, who had information that could have exposed the conspiracy. You were lovers? Amelia asked, her voice quiet, her gaze searching Sophie's face, her heart aching with a complex mix of emotions, jealousy, sympathy, understanding. Sophie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, she replied, we were. But it was more than that. We were partners. In every sense of the word. Amelia felt a pang of something. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more a sense of shared loss, shared grief, shared connection. They had both loved Harold in their own way, and they had both lost him in their own way. We need to get him help, Bellingham said, his voice urgent, breaking the silence, bringing them back to the immediate crisis. We need to get him out of here, out of Paris, out of France. The doctor, a discreet, efficient woman who had been silently observing them, stepped forward. I can stabilize him, she said, her voice calm, professional, but I can't reverse the effects of the drug completely. Not here. Not with the resources I have. Where can we take him? Amelia asked, her voice desperate, her fear for Harold growing. There's a place, Sophie said, her voice thoughtful, her gaze fixed on Harold. A place in the Shenandoah Valley. In America. A sanctuary. A place where he can heal. A place where he can be safe. The Shenandoah Valley? Bellingham repeated, his voice questioning. How do we get him there? I have contacts, Sophie replied, her voice firm, her resolve hardening, people who can help us. People who can smuggle us out of France. Across the Atlantic. To America. They knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, a flight from a broken city, a journey into the unknown. But they had no choice. They had to try. They had to save Harold. They had to expose the truth. They looked to each other, their faces gaunt. They nodded once, in unison. Chapter 18. Sanctuary in the Shenandoah. The journey was a blur, a clandestine odyssey across borders and oceans, a testament to Sophie's network of contacts and their shared, desperate determination. They moved under the cover of darkness, utilizing a series of safe houses, forged documents, and carefully orchestrated diversions, always one step ahead of their pursuers, always looking over their shoulders. Harold remained in a semi-conscious state, his body weak, his mind clouded, his moments of lucidity fleeting and fragile. Amelia stayed by his side, constantly, her hand clasped in his, her voice a soothing murmur, her presence a tether to reality, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Bellingham, his usual stoicism softened by a growing concern for Harold and a quiet admiration for Amelia's unwavering strength, managed the logistics, navigating the treacherous world of spies and smugglers, his connections and experience proving invaluable. Sophie, driven by a complex mix of guilt, grief, and a fierce desire for justice, was the driving force behind the escape, her knowledge of the French underworld, her contacts within the resistance, her unwavering determination paving the way. They finally reached America, landing at a secluded airstrip in the dead of night, the vast expanse of the Shenandoah Valley stretching out before them. A landscape of rolling hills, dense forests, and hidden valleys, a world away from the war-torn cities of Europe. The sanctuary was a remote farmhouse, nestled deep in the heart of the valley, surrounded by ancient trees and a sense of profound peace, a stark contrast to the chaos and danger they had left behind. It was a place of healing, of refuge, a place where they could, hopefully, rebuild their shattered lives. The farmhouse was simple, rustic, but comfortable, its walls filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, its rooms filled with the quiet hum of nature. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the wounds of the past could begin to heal, where hope could, perhaps, begin to blossom again. A local doctor, a trusted friend of Sophie's, visited regularly, monitoring Harold's condition, providing him with the care and treatment he needed. He confirmed that the drug was slowly leaving Harold's system, but the long-term effects were still uncertain. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Amelia devoted herself to Harold's care, nursing him, reading to him, talking to him, sharing memories of their life together, hoping to rekindle the spark of recognition in his eyes, to awaken the man she loved from his drug-induced slumber. Slowly, gradually, Harold began to improve. His moments of lucidity became more frequent, more prolonged. He started to recognize Amelia, to respond to her touch, to speak her name. One evening, as the sun set over the Shenandoah Valley, casting a golden glow over the farmhouse, Harold reached out, his hand trembling, and touched Amelia's face, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his voice his own. Amelia felt a surge of emotion, a wave of relief, of joy, of overwhelming love. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, her tears flowing freely. "I'm here, Harold," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm here. You're safe now. You're home." Harold smiled, a weak, fragile smile, but a smile nonetheless. I remember," he said, his voice barely audible. "I remember you." It was a small victory, a fragile beginning, but it was enough. It was a sign that he was coming back to her, that he was healing, that he was alive. The sanctuary in the Shenandoah was living up to its name. The rolling hills, the calming sounds of the birds, even the crisp, clean air was slowly bringing Harold back. But even here, under the watchful eyes of Sophie and Bellingham, the world continued to intrude. One late and stormy night, a car arrived. Chapter 19. The Reckoning of Lost Years. The unexpected arrival of the car, its headlights cutting through the stormy night, shattered the fragile peace of the Shenandoah sanctuary. The sound of the engine, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, sent a jolt of fear through Amelia, a reminder that they were not yet safe, that the past still cast a long shadow. Bellingham, ever vigilant, was instantly on alert, his hand moving to the pistol he now carried openly. Sophie, her face etched with concern, joined him at the window, peering out into the darkness, trying to identify the visitor. Amelia stayed with Harold, who had been sleeping soundly, his recovery progressing slowly but steadily. She held his hand, her touch a reassurance, a silent promise of protection. The car stopped in front of the farmhouse, its headlights illuminating the porch, casting long, dancing shadows. A figure emerged, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the rain and the darkness. Bellingham opened the door, his pistol held at the ready, his voice cautious but firm. "Who's there?" he demanded. "It's me," a voice replied, a familiar voice, a voice that sent a chill down Amelia's spine. The figure stepped forward into the light, revealing his face. It was Arthur Bellingham, Sr., Arthur Bellingham's father, a man of immense power and influence, a man Amelia had only met once, briefly, during the initial investigation into Harold's disappearance. He was a man rumored to be deeply involved in the shadowy world of intelligence and espionage, a man with connections that reached the highest levels of government. "What are you doing here?" Bellingham Jr. asked, his voice tight, his suspicion evident. Bellingham Sr. ignored his son, his gaze fixed on Amelia, his expression unreadable. "I need to speak with Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice firm, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Alone." Amelia felt a surge of apprehension, but she also knew that she couldn't refuse. This man, this powerful man, held the key to the final pieces of the puzzle, the truth about Harold's disappearance, the truth about the conspiracy. She nodded, her gaze meeting his unflinchingly. "All right," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll talk to you." Bellingham Jr. and Sophie exchanged concerned glances, but they stepped aside, allowing Bellingham Sr. to enter the farmhouse. Amelia led him into the small, cozy living room, its walls lined with bookshelves, its air filled with the scent of wood smoke and old paper. She gestured towards a chair, but he remained standing, his presence dominating the room. "I know about my son's involvement," Bellingham Sr. said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on Amelia, his expression regretful, apologetic. "And I know about the photograph." Amelia said nothing, her silence a challenge, a demand for answers. "I came here to tell you the truth," Bellingham Sr. continued, his voice heavy with unspoken emotions, "the whole truth. Even if it implicates me." He paused, taking a deep breath, as if gathering his courage, as if preparing to reveal a long-held secret. "The conspiracy, it was real," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a group of officials, disillusioned with the war, seeking to profit from the chaos. They manipulated events, sabotaged peace negotiations, prolonged the suffering for their own gain. "And you were one of them?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling, her anger simmering. Bellingham Sr. hesitated, his gaze shifting away, his silence a confession. "I knew about it," he admitted, his voice filled with shame. "I looked the other way. I didn't stop them." "And Harold?" Amelia asked, her voice rising, her grief and anger overwhelming her. "What about Harold?" "Harold, he was a threat," Bellingham Sr. replied, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the floor. "He discovered the truth. He was going to expose them. They had to silence him. They tried to kill him," Amelia said, her voice filled with horror, with realization. "Yes," Bellingham Sr. confirmed, "but I intervened. I couldn't let them kill him. I arranged for him to disappear. To be protected." "Protected?" Amelia repeated, her voice incredulous. "You call that protection? Drugging him? Stealing his memories? Leaving him a shell of his former self?" "It was the only way," Bellingham Sr. insisted, his voice desperate, his eyes pleading for understanding. "It was the only way to keep him alive. To keep him safe from them." "And the photograph?" Amelia asked, her voice relentless, her demand for answers unwavering. "The photograph, it's the proof," Bellingham Sr. replied. "It's the evidence that can expose them all. It's the key to bringing them to justice." He took from his coat a small, leather-bound case. From within, he removed the complete photograph. Chapter 20. A New Dawn, a New Promise. Bellingham Sr. carefully placed the complete photograph on the small table between them, the image a stark reminder of the long, arduous journey they had undertaken, the sacrifices they had made, the truth they had uncovered. The photograph, now whole, revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, the faces of the men who had betrayed their country, their oaths, their honor. It was a damning piece of evidence, a testament to the corrupting influence of power, the devastating consequences of greed and ambition. Amelia looked at the photograph, her gaze lingering on Harold's face, younger, less haunted, but still recognizable, his presence in the image a poignant reminder of what had been lost, what had been stolen. "What happens now?" Amelia asked, her voice quiet, her gaze shifting to Bellingham Sr., her anger tempered by a sense of closure, resolution. "Now we bring them to justice," Bellingham Sr. replied, his voice firm, his determination evident. "We expose them. We reveal the truth. We make them pay for what they've done." He looked at Amelia, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, his voice low, his words heavy with unspoken emotions. "I can't bring back the years you've lost, the suffering you've endured. but I can help you build a future. A future free from the shadows of the past. Amelia nodded, her own eyes filled with tears, her heart aching with a complex mix of grief, anger, and gratitude. Forgiveness? What about Harold? Amelia asked, her voice trembling, her concern for him paramount, her love for him unwavering. He'll need time, Bellingham Sr. replied, his voice reassuring. He'll need care. He'll need love. But he'll heal. He'll recover. He'll be himself again. He paused, his gaze shifting towards the hallway, towards the room where Harold was sleeping, his presence a silent promise, a beacon of hope. You've given him that chance, Bellingham Sr. said, his voice filled with gratitude. You've saved him. You've saved us all. The storm outside had subsided, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle, the wind whispering through the trees. The first rays of dawn were beginning to peek through the clouds, casting a pale, golden light over the Shenandoah Valley, illuminating the farmhouse, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. Amelia walked to the window, looking out at the valley, her heart filled with a sense of peace. The journey had been long, arduous, painful, but it had also been transformative. She had faced her fears, confronted her demons, discovered her strength. She had found love, lost love, and found it again, stronger, deeper, more resilient. She had uncovered the truth, exposed the conspiracy, brought the traitors to justice. She had saved Harold. She had saved herself. As the sun rose, casting its warm glow over the valley, Amelia felt a sense of hope. A new dawn, a new promise, a new beginning. A future free from the shadows of the past, a future filled with love, with healing, with possibility. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Harold. He was standing beside her, fully dressed. He embraced her. Epilogue. Years passed. The Shenandoah Valley became their home, a sanctuary where they rebuilt their lives, brick by brick, memory by memory. Harold, with Amelia's unwavering love and support, and aided by the slow, patient work of time and therapy, gradually recovered. The scars of the past remained, etched on his mind and soul, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer a ghost, a shadow, a puppet. He was Harold, whole again, healed, free. The conspirators were brought to justice, their crimes exposed, their power shattered. The photograph, the crucial piece of evidence, played a pivotal role in their downfall, a testament to Amelia's courage, her determination, her unwavering pursuit of truth. Bellingham Sr., haunted by his own complicity, devoted the rest of his life to atoning for his sins, using his influence and resources to support causes that championed justice, transparency, and peace. Sophie remained a close friend, a confidant, a sister in arms. She had found a measure of peace in the Shenandoah, a refuge from the shadows of her past, a place where she could heal and rebuild. She and Amelia shared a bond forged in adversity, a connection deepened by shared loss, shared grief, shared love for the same man. Amelia and Harold built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with quiet moments of shared joy. They had children, grandchildren, a family that blossomed in the fertile soil of the Shenandoah Valley, a testament to their resilience, their strength, their enduring love. They often walked together in the fields surrounding the farmhouse, hand in hand, their silence comfortable, their connection profound. They would look out at the rolling hills, the ancient trees, the vast expanse of the sky, and they would remember. They remembered the darkness, the fear, the pain. They remembered the betrayal, the loss, the suffering. But they also remembered the courage, the determination, the hope. They remembered the love that had sustained them, the strength that had guided them, the truth that had set them free. And as they looked out at the valley, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, they knew that they had found their peace, their sanctuary, their home. They had found each other, again, and they had found a future they would build together, brick by brick, memory by memory, love by love. The scent of gunpowder had long since faded, replaced by the sweet aroma of honeysuckle and fresh earth. The boot prints were gone, washed away by time and rain, but the shadow by the door, the shadow of a love that had endured the trials of war and betrayal, remained, a constant reminder of the journey they had taken, the battles they had fought, the victory they had won. Their life now was a quiet symphony, a testament and tribute to all they had overcome. Together,